Welcome to Our Interesting Times with host Timothy Kelly, who interviews today's top alternative and revisionist thinkers.
May you live in interesting times.
It is my pleasure tonight to have Jay Dyer back on the show. Jay, how you doing?
Great, Tim. How are you?
Great. Listen, thanks for coming back on the show. And, of course, you are the proprietor of Jay's Analysis, jaysanalysis.com. And you're the author of Esoteric Hollywood. Is it Sex, Cults, and Symbols? Right?
Yes.
Okay. And that's due out in the fall?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So just in time for the Christmas season. Good.
Actually, yes, it will be a good Christmas present.
Yeah.
I was trying to think, is it too, it's not a scandal book, so yeah, actually, I think it'll work for Christmas.
Stocking. Is it good, small for a stocking stuffer?
It's typical, 11 by, I don't know, whatever the lengths of a book are. I don't know.
8 by 11 or
Yeah.
Half by 11. So great. Okay. Well, tonight, been a while since you've been on a show. I think late June you were on the show, and you've since published 3 episodes of your Tragedy and Hope series, part 4, 5, and 6, and let's talk about that for a while tonight. You in part 4, you talked about how the bankers had colluded in France and sort of take over the country via the rise of Napoleon, and this consolidation of power led to the rise of the central bank, who, of course, Napoleon handed power over to the central bank.
Yes.
And you say just the same thing FDR did, and quickly explains that. In part 5, you discuss the lead up to the Second World War, the intrigues of Chatham House, and the hyping of fears of Nazi Germany, and Hitler, of course, the Pearl Harbor scam, and Bill Donovan working to undermine Spain, and there's the intrigues of Asia. And part 6, most recent addition to that, you talk about how Hitler was maneuvered by the Western powers to become the boogeyman, the evil dictator that's going to take over the world, and that was more or less a setup by the Atlanticists. So, let's take it on. How do you want to address this?
Well, I think it is important. I'm glad you mentioned that French chapter, because that French chapter in Quigley really had a lot of nuggets that were new to me, and a lot of details that I haven't seen anywhere else. And so when he talks about he says Swedish Protestant bankers, and I think he mentions England. I may have to pull that page up, but he mentions these foreign banking interests, and specifically at that time, originally at the time of the revolution, he says that they were very interested in funding a revolution in France. And I had some really good grad classes or undergrad classes on the French Revolution that were, I think, instrumental in me just stepping aside of Quigley for a second to understand where we are in modernity. And I think it's always good to go back to, the French Revolution and to understand the terror there, because it's, modern terrorism doesn't just originate in the 20th century. It goes back, obviously, in warfare, ancient times, and so forth. But for the modern era, in Western civilization, you need to look no further than than France in the stages of 1789 and so forth on into the Napoleonic period. And I thought that Quigley's treatment of this was very insightful. And so it's not just that Napoleon. Well, what I think is interesting is that Napoleon, and I think what you're hinting at is what I covered is the model of the revolutionary coming along. And when we think about the French Revolution, we have to understand that they were bourgeoisie. They were merchant class revolutionaries, many of them nobles. Okay, so this is not a low class peasantry Occupy Wall Street group, although they in ways they might be predecessors to the sort of now fizzled Occupy group. But they were the French revolutionaries were a little bit closer maybe to the Tea Party or American revolutionaries, at least in the groups that were successful. And of course, this is where we get that divide between the Jacobins and the Girondins. Now, part of the revolutionary ethos, the terror aspect with Committee for Public Safety and Robespierre, they were maniacs. They were bloodthirsty. I don't know for sure if the Rothschilds were behind that. I know that a lot of people have said that, but from Quigley's section on France, again, it's these outside banking interests. I think he says Swiss Protestant and outside banking interests, or something to that effect, if I remember. But they had a vested political interest in seeing the end of the monarchy, and particularly its close connection to Catholicism in France. And so you can't forget these religious aspects either, as you and I touched on that on a recent talk with the targeting of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Holy Roman Emperor, which Hitler or at least World War I had a big hand in destroying, and the many lives that were lost at the time of World War I in terms of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the wars of the 20th century have their predecessors in, again, these historical and political events in Europe, and the Reformation is a big part of that. So I don't think that the French Revolution could have happened apart from the Protestant Reformation, precisely because of the ideological changes that accompanied both the Enlightenment and the Protestant Reformation. I think all those are kind of a package deal. And, Quigley more or less says that in some of the early chapters that we covered before and in some of the later chapters. So what we're looking at here is a big shift in social order and the ideas of, altar and throne, being demonized, being evil, and now needing to be replaced by updated ideas of, in the case of the French Revolution, nationalism. So what we're going to get out of the French Revolution will be the modern conception of the nation state, which at that time is a liberal idea. Now, I'm not equating nationalism in our day with liberalism. I understand that that's generally considered the right-wing perspective, but historically, at least, the movement out of whether it be the imperial notion of Byzantium or the imperial notion of the Holy Roman Empire, or these going back to Charlemagne, essentially in the West, the movement of nationalism is associated with German princes and the Reformation, with their working in tandem with Luther. Luther was able to garner several German princes on his side to rebel against the papacy. We need to look no further than Henry VIII and his issues of divorce and rebelling against the office of the papacy, creating the Church of England. And so you get these national churches that arise out of the Reformation, which are, I believe, an aberration, but they point to what's going to happen with the rise of nationalism proposed French Revolution. So what you get with the French Revolution is this idea of a Masonic, non-Protestant nation. You get the secular nation state, and this is what we find in the many Masonic philosophers of the French Revolution: Diderot, Voltaire, these guys who would write these big intellectual encyclopedias. Right, the first encyclopedia comes from Diderot and Voltaire and these characters, and I believe it has the emblem of Lucifer on it. It has a goat-footed character that that Voltaire and these figures considered to be the the embodiment of reason over against priestly superstition. So this is what is so important about French Revolution, and this is why Quigley, I think, does a good job in that chapter of showing that the trajectory of France is completely determined by the bankers, and it's a model then for the rest of the countries in terms of how the central bankers basically plotted to take over the countries. And the way that happens is, as we said, through this revolutionary model being funded, fostered by offshore interests, foreign nations, foreign power blocs. And once they've significantly destabilized the region with, oftentimes legitimate criticisms of the existing rulers. That's not to say that, the Sun King or Louis the 16th or any of these people were saints. But the problem is that what the revolution brings is oftentimes a lot worse. And so this is where, we get the mentionings of modern democracy. Feminism, Mary Wollstonecraft will actually come out of this same revolutionary fervor. She's one of the proto-feminists of this period, writing treatises on suffrage and so forth. And so what happens is these revolutionary governments fail because they're just a bunch of vagabonds and demagogues trying to put together some sort of so-called idealistic republic based on secularism. They persecute religion, they persecute theology immensely, tremendously. A lot of martyrs out of that period. And what they do is you get the eventual rise of Napoleon. And Napoleon rises up because and when you have these democracies, they fall into tyrannies, they fall into oligarchies, and that's what Napoleon represents. But Quigley makes the amazing statement that the same bankers were behind Napoleon because once Napoleon came to power, he handed over the assets of the country to the bankers. Now, at that time, there's three factions. There's Protestants, there's the Catholics, and there's the Jewish factions of banking in France. And basically, like we saw earlier in our talks with Japan, these big corporate conglomerates and banking conglomerates would make deals and would have fights and wars between one another. And over time, they consolidated power. And so to sum up the entirety of the France chapter, basically, Quigley says that Rothschild came up on top in terms of France. And this is Quigley's claim. He also makes the claim that for Western banking, that the J.P. Morgans and the Rockefellers and Chase and all that would, according to Quigley, would surpass the Rothschilds. Now, I guess that they could be debatable, or it could be debated, but this is what I'm reporting what Quigley says. Mm-hmm. So you get Rothschild coming out on top in the 20th century in France, and of course we know about Waterloo and the Rothschilds sitting at their agents and the different sons of Nathan Rothschild and these others that are in charge of the central banks in other countries. And there's obviously that's true. You just go to mainline. I had mainline history classes on modern Europe. We talk about the Rothschild banking industry. There's no secret to that. I mean, but the reason it's so important is that same model is exactly what you get with FDR. You get financial instability. You get calls for revolution. And even though FDR might not be a quote demagogue or oligarch in the sense of what we think of as Napoleon, it doesn't matter whether FDR is talking about the rights of the people. Napoleon talked about the rights of the people, right? So we might think of them as opposite ends of the spectrum politically, but they serve the same function because, as we saw, FDR hands over the country to the bankers once he runs up all this debt through the public works programs. And who knows what black budget debts are run up through Manhattan Project, right? So there's just no telling with these black books and all that. But it just boils down to, and the reason it's relevant today is that I believe that it's the same model that we see with the color revolutions. It's the same pattern, and you get these guys that come in, and John Perkins, economic hitman style stuff. They'll just slice up your country and hand it over to the bankers. You're suddenly in debt. The IMF says, "Oh, we'll save you. Here's $18 billion." And so this is, again, all these same things that we see in media today, especially in alternative or independent media or whatever. They just have precedent in older scams is the best way I can put it. So that I think is the most memorable, crucial aspect of the chapters dealing with France and Great Britain leading up to the war, because it's this same class of people in Britain. It's the the Cliveden set, the Astors and others that we mentioned before. They're basically running these same scams, and so what they do is that they game the system by picking out which nations can be played off against one another in a Brzezinski style chessboard, and then you're going to base your economic decisions, your investments, on how you think that war is going to play out. Just like you might bet on the two top steeds, right? And that's what these people do. And I'm convinced that even though, I went into this already kind of believing that Hitler was probably some kind of, funded asset of the West from other books I'd read, but I was really looking forward to Quigley's treatment of it. And for when we get to the period of Hitler, for me, really, it's just a question of to what degree was Hitler? I mean, was he? There was some guy who has a book even saying he's a British agent. I wouldn't find that impossible. I don't know, but it really just comes down to a question of degree, more so than it does a question of was Hitler coaxed and aided and built up by the West. I have no doubt. Quigley explicitly says that. But to what degree, I don't know. Then that would be an interesting question to ponder. But yeah, that's why all this stuff is relevant, because we're living in that world bequeathed to us by the revolutionaries, by the Reformation, by the Enlightenment. That put us in this situation of secularism. It all comes from this stuff.
Mm-hmm. And now with Napoleon, of course, Napoleon starts his many military campaigns. These are expensive, so he has to borrow money from somebody. And this is what the bankers like. So they're lending money to both sides, and then
yes,
someone like a Rothschild who gets advance word of Napoleon's defeat, and he spreads rumors of Napoleon's victory at Waterloo, and that enables him to, let the stock prices fall in London, and then he turns around and buys them up for a song, and of course when the real news gets out, stock prices skyrocket, and he's made this is his fortune.
Same thing. Yeah. I would say Soros does. He's even bragged about breaking the Bank of England, and I think that's exactly what Soros does in these color revolutions in foreign countries.
Yeah,
and he serves a function too, as part of the U.S. State Department and all that, kind of working in tandem with that. But I don't doubt that he does these operations in other countries that will ultimately benefit him economically. For example, the ridiculous Bond film, The World Is Not Enough. I think you and I might have mentioned this before, but it's so close to some of these pipeline situations where the terrorists pop up, right? And I just did an interview with Andrew Korybko, and he posits in his book Hybrid Wars that you can predict where the next terror scenario or hotspot's going to be, based on where the next color revolutions are going to be, based on where the plans for infrastructure and pipelines are going to be.
Yeah.
And so what's funny about that, after I interviewed him, I was sitting there thinking, this is just like that stupid Pierce Brosnan Bond movie with Sophie Marceau and Denise Richards, where Sophie Marceau is this, she's from Azerbaijan, and she's going to build a pipeline. And she's an Orthodox Christian, by the way, in the film. And she turns out to be the terrorist who's bombing her own pipelines. Now, of course, if in reality this was the case, I would say, be Western intelligence who would be bombing, rival pipelines to Exxon, Shell, and BP. I don't think that Electra King, who's the character of Sophie Marceau, the villain in the Bond film, I don't think she would be bombing her own pipelines. I think it'd be the other way. You would have the terrorists, i.e. ISIS, being run not by an Orthodox, wealthy Orthodox Christian mastermind, but that's propaganda, but by the Atlanticist establishment, that's what they do with ISIS. So I see some pretty profound predictive programming in this rather ridiculous Bond movie, especially, most of the The Pierce Brosnan ones are almost as goofy as the Roger Moore ones, but a very good modern parallel to the things that we're talking about with sparking conflicts in a region if you're a big power player in order to profit and gain from that. I mean, obviously we all know about the wars being for oil, but it goes beyond that because individuals can actually achieve a lot of different ends. You can achieve social change. You can achieve what we talked about before. All of this democracy that's exported really just amounts to getting Coke, Pepsi, vaccines, abortions, Rockefeller education centers, and so forth. That's what it amounts to.
And GMOs in the Ukraine.
Exactly. Well, what do we see in the Ukraine? I mean, these gorgeous, right, Ukrainian women. And now when we look at the news about the Ukraine and there's these giant gay parades and these transvestites parading down the streets of Ukraine, and you look at the NGOs and the Orange Revolution that brought all this, it's just quite obviously is at the behest of the Western power structure.
Yes, it is. It is obvious.
And who in their right mind would want to get rid of these gorgeous Ukrainian women? Would you rather see like this bearded lady walking down the street with they're strapped in leather and fat rolls hanging off? And that's what you see. Or you want to look at Mila Jovovich from she's from the Ukraine. These gorgeous women. I mean, it is a demographic warfare. But see that demographic warfare, that economic warfare, and we'll talk about that because Quigley will talk about economic warfare. But all these things are weaponized, and
you don't want voluptuous, beautiful, curvaceous women because that denotes fertility.
It's all about exactly that denotes fertility, and what's the number one top of the agenda? Depopulation.
Yes, and so if you have beautiful women walking around, there's going to be behavior that creates lots of babies. So
it does happen, doesn't it?
So and obviously, and also if you respect the differences between the sexes, it makes the sexes attracted to one another. It's when you blur the distinctions.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
And now, just a side note here, I don't want to get too off topic, but I thought it was interesting. Mila Jovovich is an interesting character, and I chose her because I think she's really good looking, and she's at the top of my blog. And I always get these comments, people asking, "Who's the tranny at the top of your blog?" Like, it's not a transvestite; it's like a gorgeous woman, but. She actually made some pretty public statements standing up for the journalists that were jailed in the Ukraine, which I thought was interesting because you don't usually see, Hollywood type persons taking that kind of a stand. And then when you look into this a little bit deeper, it looks like the Western media then tried to take that and spin it and say that she was making anti-Russian statements. And then she's like, well, no, I'm actually from the Ukraine and I grew up speaking Russian. And her mom, interestingly, was reportedly, she was a famous Soviet actor, and her mom was interrogated by the KGB before they expatriated to the U.S. So I don't know what to make of all that, but it's just very interesting that when you dig into these people, some of these, this is again another when we talk about Hollywood and the deep connections in Hollywood, and there's some interesting stuff there. I don't know what to make of it, but I did think that it was interesting that the coverage between what she said on RT and the coverage between what the Times of Israel said about it was vastly different for the same statement. She was saying support our journalists in the Ukraine. So, meaning the Russian journalists in Ukraine. So, and then there was also in that same piece of the Times of Israel, they were saying, oh, well, Mila Kunis says, all Russia's at fault here. And, the Ukraine needs to be updated. They need, gay rights and all this gobbledygook. So, I don't know. But I say that just to kind of take a little detour from the Quigley stuff. But no, it's not a tranny on my website.
So, and in part 5, again, we talk the run up to World War II, and you have the Atlanticist network that is a one-time appeasing Hitler, which appears to be setting up Germany, allowing Germany to prepare for war, and also this creates fear and apprehension in the West. Same time, there's a big propaganda machine churning out, all types of Well, yes, fear mongering regarding Hitler's ambitions and what he represents. But at the same time, you cover in this part how the Cliveden set in Britain is working what appears to be two different angles on this. Want to get into that? They're opposing Hitler and supporting Hitler. What type of dialectic does this create?
Yes, this is one of the most fascinating aspects in the entire book because of the revelations that Quigley has. Real quick, I did want to say that on that same page, when you go back to page 514 and 15, I did find it here, where Quigley talks about France. He mentions the European common market, which would be established through Bilderberg, and this vindicates the research of Daniel Estlin, his Shadow Masters book, where he claims from some of the older Bilderberg documents that they were planning the European common market, the EU, back in the 40s. Quigley backs that up on page 415 and 514 and 515. Now, the exact quote on the financial capitalism that ruled France was that the bankers, all Protestant, were deeply involved in the agitations that led up to the French Revolution. When the revolutionary violence got out of hand, they were the chief forces behind the rise of Napoleon, whom they regarded as the restorer of order. As a reward for this support, Napoleon in 1800 gave the bankers the monopoly over French financial life by handing them over the Bank of France. So that, I don't know, I thought that was a great quote. But Hitler, interestingly, is...
by the way, the same thing occurred in England with the creation of the Bank of England.
Yes, it's the same model in the Federal Reserve as well.
Yeah. So go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's cool. So what's interesting is that you got the roundtable groups that Quigley mentions on 620 and 621, and here he's saying that there's a secret 7-point agreement between the Cliveden set and Ribbentrop and Hitler. And what the secret agreement is at this time, this is like November 1937, they were saying, all right, we're going to have a four-power pact, Britain, France, Italy, and Germany. And we're going to exclude Russian influence. Britain had no objection to the German acquisition of, listen to this, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Danzig.
Wait a second.
Yeah.
Wait, no. Britain went to war to save all those areas, right?
Exactly.
or at least Poland, right? At least Poland.
This is the 7-point secret agreement. Germany must not use force. Yeah, right. Which would lead to Britain having to intervene in war. Britain wanted an agreement with Germany restricting the number of bombs that would be bombing planes that would be built. Britain was prepared to give Germany all the colonial areas in South Central Africa, as well as the Congo and Portuguese Angola, if Germany would sign an international agreement to govern these areas with due regard for the rights of the natives. Oh, yeah, right. Like the British are so concerned with native rights. Britain would put pressure on Czech and Poland to negotiate with Germany based on Germany's desires, and Britain would then rearm in order to maintain its position in this 3-block world. So that's the key. That's what's key to this. And we saw that it was World War I, according to Quigley, that the majority faction of the Cliveden set wanted to achieve the 3-block world, and that's what they obtained. And we go from the 3-block world and after World War II to the 2-block world. And I think that this is a great indicator that was the strategy, of this Cliveden set. And where obviously I'm not saying it's all City of London, but it's the City of London in tandem with, the American bankers, because they were eventually able to Britishize the U.S. through the means that we've talked about before: Hollywood, Quartus Circle, MGM, Ian Fleming, Bill Donovan, William Stevenson, in the circles of Disney as well. All of that was designed by British intelligence, and it's in the article that I did on Christopher Lee and The Devil Rides Out, I cite is it Peter Knightley? I always forget this guy's book. Not Peter Knightley, but it's over here on my shelf somewhere. But the book that deals with British intelligence operations. What is that book? Anytime I'm on a show and I'm trying to find a book, I can't ever find it. And then if I'm not, it's right there. But it may be Philip Knightley's book. I don't know, but it's the book that deals with William Stevenson, his influence with Bill Donovan and getting FDR into the war. Now,
it's not Desperate Deception, is it? Thomas Mull, I think.
Let me think on it a minute. I'll pull it out of these stacks here in a second. But there's some really great quotes in that. I can just pull up the article on Double Rides Out. But
these British intrigues, that's like an original plan of the Rhodes Trust, right? The Rhodes Circle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The Clive said is these roundtable people.
Yeah, it's the roundtable plan.
And they had the Foreign Affairs magazine in the UK. I believe that's what it's called.
Is it called Foreign Affairs in the UK too? The RAI.
It is called. Oh, excuse me. It's just called the Roundtable magazine.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Yeah.
Because Foreign Affairs is a CFR publication.
Right. Articles in the Roundtable magazine were floated as trial balloons to see the reaction to British support of Hitler. Quigley says on page 621, and this is a publication of Chatham House. He says, the propaganda first appeared in the effusions of the Roundtable group, whose leader, Lord Lothian, had visited Hitler in 1935 and had been publishing his 7-point program in the Times and the Roundtable at Chatham House and at All Souls with Lord Halifax. In the December 1937 issue of the Roundtable, where most of the 7 points of Halifax were discussed with Hitler, and then that didn't go over well. So what they had to do was, what's so fascinating about this is that they were running. It is Philip Knightley. It's his book, The Second Oldest Profession, Spies and Spying in the 20th Century. And that's where he says Donovan was helped to prepare his submissions to Roosevelt by Stevenson and the SIS officers attached to his staff. 2 senior intelligence officers, Admiral John Godfrey and Lieutenant Commander Ian Fleming, crossed the Atlantic to work on this campaign. And this is that shutting up these America First people and getting them into Britain First, right? Now, doesn't the... we'll see some of that in terms of psychological operations in the 60s, British invasion, but that's more social engineering. But what, excuse my my little addendum there. But so what's amazing about this is what Britain starts doing is running these fake news stories. So they suddenly start running fake news because the population wasn't on board with the acquiescence to Hitler. They start saying, Hitler is preparing for war. We got to arm Britain. We don't have any. They've cut our funding. We've got no war funding. What are we going to do? And they start running news reels and news stories about gas attacks, and they were handing out gas masks, which Quigley laughs about and says because that wouldn't have done anything, and there was absolutely no threat of a gas attack. But
this was the talk of the bombing. The bombers will always get through. The fear of
yes.
And you have the H.G. Wells movie, right? The Shape of Things to Come, right? Early 30s.
Yeah, and if you watch the, I guess the Time Machine movie, that would be what 50s, because the Time Machine movie ends with more of the atomic propaganda.
Yeah.
Where they were actually in the beginning where he goes into the future and he sees Britain nuked. But anyway, that's post World War II. But so the Clive set wants to appease Hitler and support him in his movements into Czechoslovakia and into Poland and in taking Danzig. And he even says that the monetary and resource support continued into the war. He was getting resources from France. And so I believe they're just using Hitler.
This is like during the Phony War period, Sitzkrieg?
There is the Sitzkrieg chapter, correct? Yeah. He says they keep saying, don't fight Hitler. And they actually tell the countries, they say, when Hitler comes in, don't fight him because we're not going to aid you.
Huh. Yeah, because I read it.
That's page 633, but go ahead.
The Chamberlain's book, America's Second Crusade, about very critical of America's entry into the Second World War, and it primarily focuses on the intrigues of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and how he strongly the diplomatic communications between Great Britain and France, between the White House, was don't back up Czechoslovakia, don't back up Czechoslovakia,
Mhm.
and then back up Poland, and then don't do anything.
Okay, yeah, that's
Yeah.
pretty much what Quigley says.
So there's a similar thing going on with the United States at that time too, where they're kind of behind the scenes behind Britain, because I think the whole time Britain is thinking, yeah, we're eventually going to fight Hitler, and when we do, we're going to bring the United States into the war again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep, that's exactly what it is. Now listen to this. Quigley says, Charles Lindbergh repeated his tale of woe daily, both in Paris and in London during the crisis. The British government began to fit the people of London with gas masks, and the Prime Minister and the King called on the people to dig trenches in the parks and the squares. This is like stop, drop, and roll and get under your desk when the nukes come, right?
Or color-coded terror alerts or something.
Right.
Yeah.
School children began to be evacuated from the city. The Czechs were allowed to mobilize in September, and 3 days later it was announced that the British fleet was at its war stations. In general, every report or rumor which could be added to the panic was played up, and everything might contribute to a strong united resistance to Germany was played down. So they were playing up acquiescence still, even into, this is 1938. Well, I guess it hasn't. This is the beginning of the war, but Lord Halifax, amazingly, demands that Hitler move into Czechoslovakia. That's an amazing quote on page 636 by Quigley. The UK aids Hitler, page 637. Let's see.
This would explain the suspicions that the king who abdicated, Edward,
Yeah, exactly.
was pro-Nazi, or Halifax pro-Nazi. No, this is we're getting a glimpse into the intrigues of the Cliveden set, the British elite.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'm glad you mentioned him, because there's a great quote from Quigley. All of these events were very clearly the chief result of Munich. Germany was supreme in Central Europe, and any possibility of curtailing that power, either by a joint policy of the Western powers with the Soviet Union and Italy, or by finding an openly anti-German resistance in Central Europe, was ended. Since this is exactly what Chamberlain and his friends, i.e. the Cliveden set, wanted, and they should have been satisfied, according to Quigley. But no, because he calls the next chapter the year of dupes. And at this point, the UK is still, by the way, pro-Mussolini. So the problem's not fascism and all the ideology. But Quigley says in the next chapter that there's the secret plans of appeasement are still there, and it's called the dual policy. And this becomes the moniker for Chamberlain's period, when he's being the front man for the Cliveden set. So what they do is they hype up a lot of fear. They use these agents that we mentioned earlier. The Spying and Spying book by Knightley has a great section on this that I mentioned, and they induce the U.S. to joining in. And basically what they do is they go after the America First movement. They go after the quote isolationists, and they say that it's your fault. Like all of this terror, all of this horror that's going to happen, it's going to be laid at your feet because you didn't help out in the war. And this ridiculous propaganda that FDR will later call the 4 laws of freedom or some bullshit like that. It's so transparent and ridiculous. I think that of us reading this stuff would just laugh at it, but it worked.
No, this was the Atlantic Charter.
It is the Atlantic Charter, and the is it the 4
freedoms?
The 4 freedoms. That's it.
Freedom from want.
Yes.
Freedom to get ice cream. I don't know.
Or the Great Society later, right?
Yeah.
Some of that same
freedom from want. Wow. Okay.
But what's so amazing and telling is it's the dual policy.
Yeah,
it's the dual policy. Now they even say that the German acquisition of the Czech gold came from the Bank of London in 1939. This is what. So when they took Czechoslovakia, the Bank of London just said, okay, well here's the Czech gold that was in the Bank of London. According, this is page 644. They keep having secret meetings. Quigley says on page 635. France also aids Germany in this period of 1939 with, I mentioned that earlier, raw materials. France, throughout this period, was negotiating trade agreements to send raw materials to Germany. as a result of a deal made with Ribbentrop.
Business is business.
Exactly. Yeah. UK still supports Hitler after he invades Poland, according to Quigley. It just gets crazier and crazier. And Hitler's goal is to, he says, isolate Poland. And the UK, I kid you not. Now, Quigley's a little unclear. He doesn't say if this loan actually went through, but he says that all of London was buzzing about a secret loan of $1 billion from Britain to Germany in the same time period. Is this August 25th of 19... I believe he's still talking about 1939.
So this is a week before the outbreak of war.
It is. It's page 650. Now, he doesn't say if that went through. He just says that somebody mentioned this, and London was apparently buzzing over it, and they're like, why would we loan this guy? Right? Why would we loan him $1 billion? But
the surveying of Czechoslovakia is interesting, because Czechoslovakia had a formidable army, and
yes, the Quigley does talk about that. He says that they were actually better prepared, better soldiers, had more tanks than the Germans,
and it was just surrendered to them, and it also gave Germany control of the Skoda works, this huge industrial military.
The industry there, exactly.
Yeah, and but this would set Hitler up to be the menace, because he would have the wherewithal to invade Russia at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And what's interesting is that Russia, Quigley says on page 653, attempted to make a similar pact, and Britain went crazy and talked about how evil Russia was for making a pact with this monster when they had the same secret pact.
Yeah.
So the Anglo-Russian agreement had they were trying to have what I thought was neat about this section was that they were trying to have an Anglo-Russian agreement around this same time, April 15th, 1939. And I think the Russians were correct, because their reading of this was the Russians probably regarded this as a trap to get them into a war with Germany, in which Britain would do little or nothing or even give aid to Germany if those two fought. Now, that this was the last possibility was not completely beyond reality, from the fact that Britain did prepare an expeditionary force to attack Russia in 1940, when Britain was technically at war with Germany, but was doing nothing to fight her. There you go. So I think that's an inkling into what would become the Cold War. So as we know from Quigley elsewhere, other geopolitical writers, William Friedman at Stratfor, the key aim of the 20th century was the Atlanticist powers weakening both Germany and Russia in the 3-block model down to the 2-block through these wars.
And it's almost like these are different phases to achieve each
Absolutely.
level.
Right. And it's almost like there's a backup plan. So if they didn't get the war with Russia, then they'd just wait for it to come down the road. Mm-hmm. There is, well, Quigley speaks of the 3 stages to World War II, but there's so much in here, man. I mean, he also says, I don't want to leave out this part too, that it was a war on traditional societies and even traditional warfare of all things. And he says that the Allies are the one that accepted the Duhet doctrine of non-traditional warfare by strategic bombing of civilians.
He was the Italian air commander. Yeah,
correct. And that this was rejected by Russia and Germany, but the Allies were big fans of it. Now, I actually went and looked that up, and I read some military historians' takes on that, and they don't believe that the Allies actually adopted this doctrine. I don't know how that guy could get that, given the fact that the worst attack ever was the Tokyo firebomb. Hint, hint, worse than Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Hint, hint. The firebombing of Tokyo is the worst attack ever in history, according to Quigley, and that was a civilian Duhet-style preemptive attack, right?
Well, and there's Hamburg, there's Dresden.
Preemptive attacks of George W. Bush.
But there's Hamburg, Dresden.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, I didn't mean to leave out the attacks in Germany either, which Quigley does talk about, and he says that these even the civilian attacks didn't faze the Germans. So it's a testament to the German resolve.
Yes. the doctrine of total war. I think that was articulated in Great Britain with the Lindemann Report, which was February 1942. The justification for what they call strategic bombing campaign, the dehousing of Germany, the terror bombing.
Yeah. Okay.
It was
No,
explicitly called terror bombing, and there was
wow.
Bomber Harris,
Okay.
who commanded that. But it was the Lindemann Report which articulated this, and that to break the morale, to terrorize the German people, and it was a strategy of Britain, and then eventually the Army Air Corps of the United States, to terrorize Britain from the sky, bomb it back to the Stone Age. And I think the objective was beyond just war. I think it was really just to shatter these old traditional cities.
I know it is too, and not just the old cities, but the shattering of conventional Western techniques of warfare.
Yeah.
Because this goes, if you read Machiavelli's Art of War, that's the treatise that kind of sets the stage for the Renaissance, post-Renaissance techniques of war. After the Middle Ages, that you have a lot of understandings. Like, I mean, even in Machiavelli, like, you're not going to terrorize civilians.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, there is a distinction. You don't make war on civilians.
Yeah.
And roughly the Germans kept to that. On the East, I think it's a whole different affair. There was the war in the East was it was called a cauldron, and it was just unremittingly brutal. You had terrible treatment of Russian prisoners of war, just left to starve. But the only problem is that's horrible. But then again, turn around, and the Allies did the same thing and occupied Germany, Eisenhower's death camps.
Yes, exactly.
So it's not unique. Some of the crimes, obviously, Germany's conduct of the war can be criticized. There are atrocities committed. It was a war. The invasion of Russia was an atrocity, because horrors you're going to unleash were inevitable. But the only problem is that the Allies were guilty of pretty much the same thing.
Yes,
but Germany, even Japan, they never firebombed directly targeted civilians. Even Pearl Harbor, that was a military.
Exactly.
And things like the bombing of Shanghai, were a pinprick compared to what the Allies did. Just nothing. What the Allies did with the bombing of Germany and Japan. And incidentally, you mentioned the firebombing of Tokyo, which I think was March 1945. I think it was right after they it was Okinawa or Hiroshima where they got that island and used it as a base to bomb the jets.
Yeah, it was right after the Pacific Theater was coming to a close.
Yeah, and really, when the war was coming to a close, that's when the vicious bombing of Japan started. This is when Japan's fleet was already at the bottom of the Pacific for the most part.
Yeah, Quigley says it didn't even need to happen, but they just basically did it as a middle finger. Anyway.
Well, you had all those planes, you got to use them. But that was the thinking of all the military planners. You have Henry Hap Arnold, General Hap Arnold, who I think after Nagasaki, I think it was August 12th or 14th, ordered the 1,000-plane raid of Tokyo, bombed it again, because he wanted to show that he could get 1,000 planes into the air.
Wow.
Just to get 1,000 planes into the air. And I think you mentioned the lecture is the scientific approach to these things. You have people like McNamara, who worked on Curtis LeMay's staff.
Yeah, that will be a chapter that kind of concludes the World War II period. Where he's going to talk about the transition into the technocratic, scientific RAND corporation, rational choice theory, mutually assured destruction, all that kind of stuff. The rise of the military-industrial complex and all that.
And how all normative or moral considerations are no longer a part of strategy or weapons development, right? I mean, it's about payloads and bang for the buck and things like that.
Yes. What he says is, well, it's essentially what, the famous Beware the Military-Industrial Complex speech is about. That chapter, I'm looking for it, but that's what Quigley's talking about. And so he says you've got Vannevar Bush is one of these main characters coming out of MIT, and you've got the creation of the RAND Corporation out of the Air Force. You've got, like you mentioned, McNamara. You've got the creation of all these committees, and these committees are going to be basically committed to research. What's the term? Operations research, or basically it's just defense research, and it's weapons research is what it is. And a whole, just a vast swath of these are set up, and what they did was they recruited people out of MIT and different universities, and you got the National Academy of Sciences is a big part of this, even though it was set up in 1915. The people would come out of that and work in the National Research Council, the National NACA, National Aeronautics Commission National Commission for Aeronautics, Carnegie Endowment, Carnegie Institution. There's a whole bunch of these. Defense Research Committee, Bell Labs, MIT, Harvard, James Conant, president of Harvard, all these, Caltech, all of these are marshaled into, and once again, guess who put the money behind this? John D. Rockefeller, according to Quigley on page 841, put all this money into MIT, a large sum. And then we get, of course, the RAND Corporation. And Quigley says the goal of the RAND Corporation is the reorganization of societies. Now, what they would do is they would do test runs. Operation Bootstrap in Puerto Rico was the complete overhaul of the Puerto Rican economy to transform it into something modernized or consumerist, or what, can't be good, into as a test bed. And this was done in Operation Bootstrap, he doesn't, 42, somewhere in there. He doesn't give exact date on Bootstrap, but I'm sure you can look that up really easily. But he says persons interested in OP, operations research, also organized societies in England in 1948 and in the U.S. in 1949. And we get the quantification, the technification of everything, the rise of cybernetics and game theory, which Quigley does mention explicitly.
It's like John Nash, and that's,
Absolutely, yeah. That's what I meant to mention in that interview, or that last talk.
Russell Crowe.
We'll just call him Russell Crowe. But empiricism in the Royal Society is more or less hinted at in this same. This is an amazing chapter, because there's actually, he says, he's writing this in 1966, and he says, get ready for computers everywhere, get ready for everything being automated. All of this stuff is coming.
Cybernetics and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just today I heard an ad that Cadillac is unrolling a car it's a driver-assisted car. Yeah. How nice, how convenient, how easy.
What's a robot? It's just a robot chauffeur, Tim. Makes you feel elite.
It's like, can't park your own car. Jeez.
Yeah, somebody was on a show talking about that. Like, how ridiculous is this that do we need on, like, when I bought a new car not too long ago, they were giving me the option for what's the term? A smart trunk. I'm like, I don't need that. I was like, I'm not paying extra money for I can open a freaking trunk.
Pretty soon that'll be required, so you have to pay for it.
It will be, exactly.
Same things they've done with with Honda with a rear view cameras that it says don't use the backup. So why do I have this?
I don't want to fail to mention that there's a great, he mentions out of one of the key figures out of modern philosophy is William Van Orman Quine, and he talks about Quine's Harvard publications on mathematical logic and how this large-scale rationalization and quantification would dominate all areas of life. And if you do philosophy in college, you're going to read Quine, because he's got some very famous essays. And one thing that's funny about Quine is that he's famous for calling out empiricism, and he calls it out and he says, look, there's no justification for this. It's not logically coherent. There's a famous essay where he talks about green and blue, and he says that if you there's an object in a cave and you can't see it, and it was green when you saw it, and it later appears to be blue, and then you walk away, depending on where the light shines. He says you have no idea whether this object was green or blue, and so it's just as rational to call it groon or grew, excuse me, bloon or grew. Now, his point in that essay is to say that there is no longer a reasoned or rational justification for human endeavors, for thought processes and so forth. He says, forget all that. All that matters now is pragmatism. Now he's ironically critiquing his view, but in very much the same way that David Hume critiqued the rationalism of his day. It says, look, we're all empiricists because all we've got is our five senses, but let's not kid ourselves and think that we can actually give some sort of coherent justification. It's not possible. So all there is power politics and pragmatism. Don't worry about all this other stuff. Don't worry about philosophy and metaphysics and any of that stuff. It's meaningless. All that matters is the Death Star, basically.
Yeah. And this, again, you develop, this is American pragmatism, which is the guiding American philosophy, which stems from British utilitarianism, right?
Absolutely. And that's why I mentioned that with, Quigley mentions the British tradition of empiricism in this chapter in so many words.
Which is part of this, the development of what you call the merchant class, these sort of the Manchester School and these things. Justification for, as long as you can justify it mathematically, it's okay.
Well, the greatest example of the absurdity of this is when the utilitarians tried to come up with moral calculus, which I'm not joking, where they literally thought that you could come up with an equation by which you could determine whether actions were the degree of pleasure that an action could create. And that through moral calculus you could determine what was right or wrong based on the degree of pleasure or pain that different actions.
So
utterly ridiculous.
If I can derive maximum pleasure out of cheating on my wife, and my wife she'll dislike it, but her pain will be a lot less than my pleasure. Therefore, the pleasure is justified. Is that kind of like the?
That is one of the crucial. I'm not joking. That is one of the key criticisms of this whole utilitarian project. Is that once you reduce it to that, is that you can never ever give any coherent basis for why you should choose qualitative pleasure over quantitative.
Yeah.
Or why you should choose the pleasure of a single person over a group. Now they generally, in the utilitarian thought of when out of this comes, as we've said before, consequentialist ethics, positivism, legal positivism. So that's why it's so destructive as an ideology. But it fits perfectly with the models of Bentham and these different characters and their panopticon. Who
wrote about things like using kids and machines to turn gears, also justifying pedophilia, pederasty. I think he write the book on pederasty.
I didn't know that.
The article on the pamphlet. I think it was Bentham.
Okay.
You also get the a modest proposal, which is supposed to be in jest, but you're looking back, it probably wasn't. Mm-hmm. By what's his name, the humorist.
Say it again. What modest proposal?
A modest proposal about using children. Britain's overpopulated. Let's eat the poor children or something.
Oh yeah.
I forget. Name fails me now, but a modest proposal. But yeah, that's. This is how we get. This is how we get the Manhattan Project, right?
Yes, it is. And I wanted to mention too. The essay is very famous. A lot of people would say that it's probably one of the most famous essays of the 20th century that I mentioned from Quine. It's called Two Dogmas of Empiricism, and he basically restates that Humean tradition of saying.
Thomas, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
William Van Orman Quine's essay, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, and he rehashes David Hume centuries earlier in the Enlightenment empiricist tradition by saying that there's no justification for, or in what in philosophy we call the principle of induction, that the future will be like the past. Mm-hmm. And Quine argues this in this essay, and there's no, it's obvious, there's no way to refute this. But he's one of these characters who, like David Hume, will say, our position's irrational. So what? We don't care about rationalism anymore. Who cares? But at the same time, all these people are always talking about their atheism and so forth being rational. So, but anyway, I didn't mean to get off course there. But if people were listening and they wanted to check that out, Two Dogmas of Empiricism is a fascinating and classic philosophical essay. But so the reason we get Cold War and nukes out of this Manhattan Project is because of these very things. Rand Corporation, that's crucial for the rise of the Cold War, and the need to have this conflict that is similar to Hitler in the sense of the boogeyman, but it's also dissimilar to Hitler in the way that it would be fought out. So the Cold War is obviously not, hence Cold War, is not fought through large scale, World War II style fire raids and bombs, but rather through espionage, through surveillance, through backdoor deals, through large scale psychological operations on the populace. But it also, like Hitler, begins with, as we know, I'm sure, the exportation of Bolshevism to Russia in 1917 to begin the whole madness in Russia that results in the deaths of millions of Orthodox Christians. Many of those leaders amongst the Bolsheviks were absolutely committed Zionists. Mm-hmm. And so there's no question about that. Probably revenge for what the Tsar represented. But then by the time of, I think in one of the earlier talks, I discussed, Stalin's movement ends up splitting with the earlier Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. And you get what will eventually kind of become this national Bolshevism. I guess you could dispute that term, but that's kind of what it turns into. Where
he became sort of like this strange nationalist in a sense.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And that's why there's, at least we're told, the disagreement with Trotsky, and I think you pointed out that Trotsky might have been a German agent actually. Mm-hmm. But that's at least the cover story of why there's the disagreement between these older Bolsheviks and Stalinism. And so the Cold War, still, though, I think even with Stalin, it still requires some degree of preparation and aid from the West. And we see that by the mere fact of Yalta, right? And the Soviets basically being given a massive chunk of the world, all of Eastern Europe. I think that was the design of the Cliveden set. They're the ones that are kind of pioneering this. And then at Yalta in these different meetings, just like the previous meetings that we saw after World War I, it's all the same characters, the same bankers that are dividing up the globe and handing it over to the Soviets as the new boogeymen. And now there would not have been a Cold War had these boogeymen not been given this giant chunk of the globe. But that was what they wanted, and I don't see any other explanation for that. And I just think it's tragic because we hear all day about Zionism and this kind of stuff, and we're supposed to, only the lives of Holocaust is what matters. But what about Germans that died? What about Armenians that died? What about millions of Orthodox Christians that died? Right? We're not supposed to. Where are the museums for that? Yeah,
or the millions that starved to death in India.
Yes, many conflicts could be pointed out as selective honor, I guess, selective tears. Yeah. Well, Patrick had a good term for that, selective tears. We're talking about the Dust Boy and the CNN anchors crying over Dust Boy, and he's like, where were all the tears when the Iraqi children were being...
that's an old thing. I mentioned that the Dust Boy thing, and there's a famous photograph of the bombing of Shanghai in 1937, and there's a baby crying amidst the wreckage, and it turns out now the baby was placed there and photographed. So it's because it begs the question. Who's going to see a baby crying? I'm going to take a picture of this baby, and he's going to run over there. It's not going to be obviously a natural.
No, don't help the baby. You just tell you.
You first intervene, or it's like the drowning boy at the refugee.
Yeah, the Syrian drowning boy. Yeah,
you see a kid lying on his face down the surf, you turn him over and try to revive him. You don't take a picture of him. He's dead. Let's put him back. No. Come on.
Move his body a little for a better shot. He's dead. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Lighting's a little better if you kick it over that side.
Yeah, right.
Back light.
Put his face in the dirt.
Yeah.
It looks better.
But your point here. So the war, through the defeat of Germany, the exhaustion or destruction of German power in Central Europe, just closes out the phase of the 3 bloc, and we're entering the age of the 2 bloc, which is the bipolar world of the Cold War. And we have the development of nukes allegedly at the Manhattan Project, and they're deployed against Japan, already defeated. For all intents and purposes, in fact, she was already suing for peace. But anyway, you say that a lot of this creates a situation where the creation of the Soviet Union, of the Soviet Empire, the post-war Soviet Empire, Eastern Europe, and that this creates that second the alternative bloc, the Warsaw Pact, the communist world versus the West, and this is a part of a dialectic because now you're going to need international agencies like the UN to manage the world. And of course,
this is what Quigley says. Yes.
Yeah. And the world peace requires world management, and nukes play a big part of that. Did you? I think you've talked to the Collins brothers about this, about the cult of the superweapon. I had an interview with them about it too, about how nuclear proliferation has actually been aided and embedded by the West to create the justification for global world government.
Yeah, I think we did. You're right. I think we did have an interview on that a couple of years ago. Yeah. Yes. Now, I tend to think that there's some reality to nuclear energy as to whether the so-called radiation is so deadly as they say. I don't know. I'm gonna reserve judgment on that simply because I don't live that far from a giant nuke plant, so they do something there. Other people have alleged that it's kind of a racket where they just use electrical energy and cause it. We've also had cases locally of people that worked at that plant getting sick, and there was pretty large scale lawsuits against this entity that I think is now it was private, now it's government or something, I don't know, but it's the Paducah Gaseous Diffusion Plant, and you can look up those court cases against the plant because a lot of people got cancer who worked there. So, something toxic, I don't know what that is. Is it necessarily radiation? Is radiation hyped beyond, you look at Chernobyl and it's apparently flourishing in terms of, greenery.
No, Nagasaki and Hiroshima are both thriving cities.
Yeah. So I definitely would agree on the skepticism. And Quigley makes some bizarre statements when it comes to the A-bomb. He says, we needed a super weapon, and we got all these scientists together, and they came up with the plans in 3 weeks. It only took 3 weeks, and then we just had to make it. That's a little suspicious, but
that's that American can-do attitude.
Exactly. That's a great point. Yeah, and there's other.
We put a man on the moon, didn't we?
Exactly. Oh. There's other suspicious things too, like that the 1945 to 50 period atomic spy stories are made up by Hollywood. That was a great section on page 860 to 61. Now he does say that he thinks that the Klaus Fuchs story and the Alan Nunn May stories have some truth to them. That's probably the case.
How about the Rosenbergs and all that?
He hasn't mentioned that, which is odd because
that was the big one.
It was the big one.
That's the green glass circle, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, and what he says is that was it Venona? Is that how didn't Venona transcripts apply to the Rosenbergs?
I'm not sure about that.
Am I wrong? What's the Venona? Anyway,
Venona were the intercepts. But I think they I think later on, after they were released, I think you're right about. I think subsequently, because they weren't released until the 90s after the Cold War. I think it is claimed that Venona vindicated the prosecution of the Rosenberg. I might be wrong, but I think that's what it was.
Yeah, I just looked it up. That's okay. It says what you said. Yeah.
Okay.
So now this is interesting because the signals intelligence in regard to this project also relate to the supposed Cambridge 5. Now, when you get into the Cambridge 5, Mark Hacker and I were having a good conversation about this because that's a subject he knows a good bit about. This might explain why the Victor Rothschild character has been supposed to be both a British spy and a Soviet spy and a double and triple agent. Because if this, in other words, he's like a master spy. He's running both of these. He's both a Soviet and a British intelligence agent because he's working for the international elite.
That is the Rothschilds?
Yeah, as I understand, Victor Rothschild is from that family.
Okay.
Now, there's a Guardian, or let's see, Guardian or a Telegraph article based on a guy's book that came out, I think, last year or a couple of years ago. Yes, Victor Rothschild is the third Baron, and yes, and yeah, so you'll see articles that, oh, oops, he was the a Soviet agent. He was a secret Soviet agent, and then oh, he was the infamous fifth man of the Cambridge spy ring that nobody's ever figured out. But you'll also find a story that, and if that's so, then I think that it points to the fact that MI5 and some of these Soviet characters were quite clearly working together. Is what I'm getting at. In other words, backdoor. Again, I think it comes down to debates about the degree, just like with Hitler. To what degree was he? Was he just a useful dupe of the British, or was he, an outright agent of the British?
Yeah.
And I don't. You know more about a lot of this than I do. I could consider myself still very much a learner in terms of the Cold War. But I am put a couple years into it, so I'm not a total virgin to the matter. But
it would explain a lot of Anthony Sutton's research. And,
yes, right.
He was a bit perplexed by it himself, I think, when he did his work. He saw it more as like treason, maybe. But I think finally he came to the conclusion. They said in one interview was captured markets and destabilization regarding Russia. Same with Germany. I don't know if he ever talked about the Mackinder doctrine and how it played into that. The idea of the sea power versus the continental power. But if you look at it the broad picture, it is the Atlanticist powers. You could include the United States, into that, sort of get the continental power. And you made a point in your talk about how continental powers are, but by their nature, their rhythms, they're more traditional, staid, slower. The sea powers are more, innovative, perhaps, if you want to say.
Yeah, this is
more aggressive.
Sort of metaphysical analysis from Alexander Dugin, so I can't take credit for that. But, Dugin, he would say that he agrees with the Mackinder view. He just doesn't agree with the Western solutions. But yeah, you're absolutely right that it ties into that.
You get people like Sir Walter Raleigh or Robert Clive, these schemers and who want to make their way in the world, and they're ruthless. They're very, very pragmatic.
Yeah. Interesting, because that would also seem to connect to if you've read any of Tarpley's older research about the Venetians.
Yeah, the black nobility and all
exactly,
that.
And the fact that the Venetian trading route in terms of the transference of goods, that would also be under this rubric of a merchant power.
Yeah.
And so you would see the same deep-seated ideology, I guess you could say, sort of passed on to the British if Tarpley's thesis is correct, that Paolo Sarpi and these different Venetian characters had a role in sort of influencing British thinking during this Renaissance period, which obviously there was some clear connection between these two entities because of the Renaissance.
And with the merchant class, you get usury,
yes,
and
exactly.
eventually sodomy. But
exactly,
the two are related. I think
you get the worship of Mammon.
I think that's why Dante's Inferno has the usurers and the sodomites in the same level of hell or something.
Oh, good point.
So there's some insight into that. It's not just Dark Ages superstition here. There's some insight into human nature.
I love I love Dante's works. And he would know, being in Florence.
Who was it? It was Neil deGrasse Tyson who you said who rejects the meaning of the value of philosophy, but then admits he's never read a word of Dante. I think you said that in your lecture.
Or I think Daniel sent me a clip of him saying that.
Yeah.
So if I remember correctly, I'm kind of tired of that. You get a million pieces of information that come through, so you gotta try to remember it all. But I think it was Tyson actually saying that he hadn't read it.
Yeah. So, but it's I mean, it is interesting how all these different ideas and come together to form a modern world.
Mm-hmm.
We have, of course, we have, the Cold War creates this situation, and we have what we have today. Again, the current geopolitical intriguing or wrangling against Russia now, it seems to be the same thing is playing out now in the post-Cold War era.
Mm-hmm.
And you have,
Absolutely.
the looting of Russia, in the 90s, and Russia fights back and to assert her independence, and because it's personified in the reign of Vladimir Putin, who's now demonized, and now we have, so it really is amazing.
Yeah.
So yeah, so you really, I mean, the thing you're doing with Tragio it's amazing. It's the analysis you give is excellent, and
Thank you.
it's really well, now it gives people an excuse not to read it because they can just rely on your analysis.
Well, somebody might say that. I'm not saying you, but somebody might say that as a criticism. But I can't tell you how many people have contacted me saying, "Thanks, I don't have time to read this thing."
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, it's it's
And of course, you could get Joe Plummer's book, and I'm sure it's good. But a lot of people don't have time to read Joe Plummer's book. But, the people can sit at work and listen to audio, and I get a lot of people saying that that's what they do. And one thing that I see as a what's the word I'm looking for? A weak point in a lot of people that do good research. A lot of guys out there that write really great stuff, and a lot of people in the alt-right that I like, or even like the Karibko article or interview that I did. I think he's got a lot of great insights, but I think a lot of people are not aware of this book still. Even the people who go into writing on geopolitics,
Mm-hmm.
and that's not to say that like you have to read this, but I think it should be required reading it in some way, because you can't overlook what the CFR and the entities that gave birth to it planned in the last century.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see how you could understand the modern geopolitical setup without these kinds of things. And I think it's more important probably than Sutton's. I mean, Sutton's stuff is good. I'm not downplaying it. I think it's great, and I think it's more or less correct. I guess you can debate, and I want to get to the bottom, eventually of a lot of this Cold War stuff, because it's a question that really kind of bounces around in my mind quite a bit, because some of the actions of Stalin don't make sense. I'd like to see exactly to what degree he went off script, and is Kerry Bolton right, or is I did an interview with Dr. Matthew Johnson. He disagrees with Bolton. He thinks that it was pretty much staged. That there was nothing anti-New World Order about Stalin at all.
Mm-hmm.
So these are guys that have, as you as well, who've studied this stuff a lot longer than I have. So I like the process of research, and getting down to the bottom of issues as best we can. Obviously these are historically conditioned events, but again, that's why Treasuring Hope is so important, is that you're getting an apologetic.
Yes, in-house. It was an in-house apologetic.
Right.
So you're getting some, like, there's revelatory information in it, because it was, at least from my understanding, it was supposed to just be read by, the people that are going to be in the State
Exactly.
in the State Department at the CFR, and
Mm-hmm.
it was meant to, I guess, propagandize them. At the same time, give them this inside information to know how it really works, but at the same time, have them think that what they're doing is good.
For the good.
Yeah,
exactly.
The greater good.
You got it. And a lot of people criticize it. They'll say, well, this is 1966. The book doesn't matter anymore. It's dated. No, well, it's not dated if it's from the archives of the people that run most of the planet.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, it's dated, but so what?
Yeah.
I mean, so is the Halford Mackinder.
Yes.
That doesn't mean he's not relevant.
I mean, you see it all. Yeah, you see it being played out right now,
Right.
or Machiavelli for that matter.
There you go.
Or Sun Tzu, or these people dated. It's like, nothing changes under the sun, as someone once said. So these things are,
Well, and one thing I want to emphasize too is that when it comes to I think you and I have talked about this. When it comes to something like Russia or any of these target areas or problem areas or whatever, it's not to say that it means that the political elite are angels or necessarily good, because I don't think any when you look at geopolitics, I think it was Francis Parker Yockey in his famous book Imperium, which I think is a great book. I highly recommend that if people want to get into even deeper philosophical analyses of geopolitics. I'm probably going to get a lot of hate mail for that because it's a quote fascist book, but that's a 700-page treatise critiquing Western liberalism. So, and it is a geopolitical book that I think also should be required reading. But Yockey says, he's Spengler's protege, he says that you can't look for morals in geopolitics. There's not good guys and bad guys, because the world doesn't work that way at that level, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not saying there aren't evil people, there are, but so it's not to say that Russia is saintly, but the more I look into these things, the more I look at what these these EU oligarchs, like that guy out of Sweden or whatever, saying that the enemy is the Christian solidarity in the East. You look at Peter Sutherland talking about the EU. You look at Soros talking about the EU and Russia. And it's a question of what the populations believe. And just like in America, there are a lot of people who are good and who believe rightly and who, are sincere and don't want to be engaged in, these foreign entanglements and so forth. Right. So in other words, just in the same way that I wouldn't judge every single person in America based on Washington, it's not about who might be in the political class of Russia. Mm-hmm. It's I believe a reflection. I mean, as I pointed out in one of the recent boiler rooms, you look at the recent Russian Orthodox Church statement, and they're calling out Bilderberg, IMF, Zionism, Masonry. This is a large national church saying this. That to me is amazing. I don't think they could get away with that if they didn't have a large amount of popular support. And so just in the same way that Trump, it doesn't matter what Trump is, he's a reflection of, the of popular opinion is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what matters. And that's what the globalists ultimately want. And I think that Dugin was right in his analysis of this when he said that the problem in Russia is not the people, it's the faction of the political elite that are in bed with the globalists.
Yeah. Yeah. And you juxtapose that statement by the Orthodox Church in Russia to the milquetoast Western Roman Catholic Church,
right.
And how, they embrace globalism and UN and these things. And a century before, you would have had popes, Catholic popes, condemning such things. Openly
they did,
writing.
Yeah, in Leo the 13th encyclicals and Pius X's encyclicals, yeah.
And how many encyclicals have there been written about the problems of Masonry, Freemasonry? And now if you mention Freemasonry to a Catholic, he'll think you're a conspiracy nut.
Yeah, you'll find this funny. Back when I was a Catholic, I'm not joking, I had a box of Leo the 13th's Humanum Janus, famous encyclical against Freemasonry, and I would go into just normal Novus Ordo parishes and pass it out. I'd leave it in the pews too. I got asked to leave one time for doing that, but I was like, "Well, it's from a pope. What is the problem?"
Well, that's why you can have outfits, like people like Bill Casey, you being a Catholic.
Oh yeah, right.
Belonging to
or the National Review people. Yeah.
Yeah, the National Review people, the CIA conservatism, which CIA is, you could say, is a Freemasonic organization. That was spawned of the CIA. That's why you can have these things, and this sort of infiltration.
Also, too, Tim, I don't want to be oversimplified and that being taken to mean that I think that everyone that's part of the Russian Orthodox Church or the Russian Orthodox groups abroad are therefore automatically good. I'm very aware of how Stalin and later the KGB would put bishops and priests into those offices. I know all about that. And
unfortunately, I don't think that the West is any different.
That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So you get that kind of, which I actually hate that. That's like one of the worst things ever is the state putting their agents into the church. I think churches. That's awful.
I mean, that's what I get a glimpse when I read some of the research, the writings of like E. Michael Jones regarding Americanism.
Yes.
And I think he's touching on that in his work. He touches on Masonry and the church, and he calls it Americanism, the ideology, and how after the Cold War, we were talking about the Cold War, how they used the fear of the Cold War to suborn the church, and this was done as a black op during the Vatican II. This was John Courtney Murray and what they were doing at Vatican II, and
yeah, I'm not. Don't mean to brag, but I do know a lot about that topic, and he's absolutely right about that.
Yeah, and
now we would disagree about the conclusions. I think that
there
was problems prior to Vatican II. That you don't think you could have had it if you didn't already have John the 23rd supporting the communist worker movements and things like that, and him writing his encyclical Pacem in Terris and arguing for international monetary control, basically communism in his epistle. And I don't know that it's been proven, but a lot of people have suggested that Angelo Roncalli was inducted into a form of Rosicrucianism or Masonry at some point. Mm-hmm. Again, it's always hard to know any kind of deep political operation like that, but when you look at the actions do seem to back up mm-hmm. What Masonry would want.
Yes.
So yeah, I think it's just tragic. There's not a simple explanation or answer to, the big churches in the last, few hundred years and what's happened to them, be it Protestant, be it Orthodox, be it Roman Catholic. It's very complex and it's very difficult. But not everybody's a bad guy either. There's plenty of good people and so forth.
And David Wemhoff wrote a book about Henry Luce and this thing, Americanism, and the suborning of the Catholic Church.
This goes back to the Carols. Interestingly, there was one of the books that I read back when I attended the Latin Mass pretty exclusively was Solange Hertz. She has a great book against Americanism. I don't know if it's still in print, but if you can find that, it's a couple hundred pages. But she, much like Jones, E. Michael Jones, probably, I'm sure he's read it. And he probably quotes it in his book. But she documents the tendencies towards liberalism, even in the famous the Carroll family. If you're familiar with them, they were prominent in the founding of America, and they were famous Catholics.
Oh, in Maryland, John Carroll of Maryland.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And she argues that they had these, Americanist tendencies back then, and that's kind of the birthing of what you would later get as you could almost argue a schism of most of the American bishops do their own thing. I mean, they don't care what, even if you go back to, I hesitate to call any of the post-Vatican II popes conservatives, but the conservative-ish rulings out of that body have always been discarded by the ICEL, International Commission for Liturgy in England, and so forth. And that's because the American Catholicism has adopted the laicism and the ideas of democracy as defining the church. And that's 100% diametrically opposed to all Christianity prior to the Reformation. So,
and David Wemhoff, he says the original sin is in the doctrine of separation of church and state.
I totally, I totally agree.
This sort of the idea where you can ward off the church, give it this little area, and everyone has a little ground, little territory, and don't bother us. Don't get in our way, and
all of those that train of encyclicals that we talked about. They say that. In fact, the Feast of Christ the King was instituted, I believe, by Pius XI. And if you read that apostolic letter that accompanies it, that's explicitly what he says. He says the separation of the church from the state is demonic. Mm-hmm. He says it's apostasy too, by the way. So, and now what do we get in these nations that do that? Well, look at former Catholic Spain. Well, now you've got abortion.
Yep. Ireland.
Gay
Poland.
rights. Yeah.
Yeah. This is the West. It's abortion, and sodomy, and but yeah. I think in your talk you talked about.
Also, too. I'm sorry, I keep thinking of things.
Okay, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention that I listened to the talks, or some of the more recent ones that you did with E. Michael Jones, and he pointed out that the bankers, uh, that there was an alliance between Protestant and Jewish bankers. And so when I was saying that the Protestant, or Quigley's quote, the Protestant bankers behind the French Revolution, I think Michael Jones is correct that there would be an alliance between the Jewish and the Protestant banking as well.
Yeah,
because if you look, especially look at the Cromwell situation, they have allied interests, especially with Cromwell and the Jews. They have allied interests in opposing the classical forms of Christianity.
Yeah,
they're much more amenable to Calvinism, things like this, than they would be to Orthodoxy or Catholicism.
And they become society becomes Judaicized, as they say. It's
that's when you'll get usury and all that.
Using this stuff, it becomes normalized. It becomes this becomes just the assumptions. You internalize the commands of your oppressors, and then you're captured by them because you no longer have a point of reference intellectually or philosophically to question these things. And we see that with the development of the American Yankee, who grew out of the Pilgrims, who were Cromwell, right? These are the people in England. So you see that lineage. It is interesting, So,
what's funny too is that the more I read a lot of older church writings, theologians, going back quite a bit. I mean, I don't even know how to. I mean, they don't believe anything like what we believe. Now, I'm not saying that nobody believes anything traditional. I'm saying that the things that nowadays would be considered hate speech, or it just boggles my mind that it's the church fathers will talk about ethnic differences.
Yeah,
they don't have any problem speaking that way. Now that would be racist talk. But I've found plenty of references of the way that the church fathers, for centuries would speak of, and that's just actually all societies, really.
Yeah.
Prior to the civil rights movement, understood that there were ethnoi, that there were distinctions between.
Well, these things matter. Ethnicity matters, and
right.
I always say we always talk about the importance of community. What's the strongest foundation for community? It's ethnic. Right? I mean, other than that, you don't have a community because people don't relate to one another.
Well, it's one of those building blocks. It's one of those building blocks, just like your gender or just like your family.
Yeah.
These are all natural building blocks.
How you break it apart? Yeah, break it apart with this alchemical thing that you might want to call integration or gender fluidity. Right? So this blurring of these distinctions, these differences, which are natural and I think are necessary, and in the final analysis, not perfect, but they're good.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. That you can read the church fathers; they'll talk about the fact that, like in Acts 17:26, that the text says that God established the differences between people. Right?
Yeah,
that's the way the text speaks, and the New Testament in the Greek will use the term ethnoi with frequency, and there's no problem there. And so the idea of the church being co-opted into some sort of Babel notion is not what the church has historically taught. The unity of the church does not consist in the destruction of ethnoi any more than the unity of the church consists in the destruction of gender. I mean, nobody hopefully would think that in church practice that the fact that there's neither Jew nor Greek nor male nor female.
Yeah.
Oh, well, then I guess we don't have genders anymore because Jesus came. No, that's utterly preposterous, and nobody ever argues that way. But that same argument has to apply if you don't think that there's ethnoi.
Yeah. And
plus, I have to point this out. This is a great one, and I was doing some reading on iconology, the icons lately, and in the Eastern tradition, you don't picture Jesus other than the way that the icons picture him. Right? You don't make an Asian Jesus, for example. Why? Well, because Jesus was from Jewish lineage.
Yeah.
He's not Asian. And why? In traditional icon theology will talk about the fact that the saints are pictured the way they're pictured because of the importance of their historical reality in their life. And part of that historical reality in life is your genealogy and your lineage.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And these differences do matter, and they're important, and they're good. The differences. I rather enjoy the differences between male and female. I quite frankly, I find women far more attractive than men.
Yeah, exactly. Who wants to see the bearded lady walking down the street of Ukraine when it could be, beautiful images of, the fact that we have the Theotokos, Mary, Mother of God.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a big part of that role is her gender and the fact that she's the new Eve.
And the notion of church, of being the bride of Christ.
Exactly.
These distinctions matter. How you relate to the church, how the church relates to people. The whole reason why the church is created is to give a physical representation of God, you could say. So, because we're physical people, we need a church.
Exactly.
So we need a church, we need an institution, and your smashing of these institutions, which are by no means perfect, is an attempt to deprive us of these institutions that we as individuals, otherwise atomized individuals, need to relate to.
To make us into that listless, groundless, deracinated, meaningless Borg that will fit into the Rand Corporation's Death Star.
Yeah. I'm getting some feedback there. Did you change the volume or something? I can hear my voice.
No, I don't think so.
I don't know if that come out in the record. That's better. Okay, maybe we're just moving. Okay,
maybe
but yeah,
broke. I don't know.
But that's what it is. It's kind of this breaking down. In the name of diversity, we all must be the same. Talk about the ultimate contradiction of liberalism. That's it
is a tyranny, and that's what is so amazing. But when you have that kind of position, even though you're flat out contradicting yourself, it doesn't matter because it gives the out because you don't believe in contradictions anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You don't, because that requires some criterion or benchmark by which you can say one thing's true and one thing's false, and your position has to not allow for that. And so it has to fall into the tyrannical will to power. And that's why so many democracy is relativism. It's based on the idea of the relativization of power, of meaning, of objectivity, of truth, of authority, be it church or state. And then what you get is the quote revolution, which relativizes everything. People become listless, as we mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the French Revolution. Mm-hmm. And what do you get? You get a dictator. And what is a dictator? Well, a dictator is an oligarch that ancient philosophy has always said is at the behest of the money power.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get ruled by your base passions. And, that you've talked about that with E. Michael Jones.
Yeah.
The raising of the passions you invert. What you do is, for example, in Eastern theology, we have the belief that man is tripartite. He has a nous, which is spirit. He has a soul, and he has a body. And it's in that order, the nous being the eye of the soul by which we see God. That was blurred by the fall. And, of course, corruption set into our bodies and so forth. And then the purpose of the gospel and all that is the restoration of man to communion and participation in divine life. So what you do if you're the devil and his minions is that you invert all of these things. You invert gender, you invert the relationships, you invert authority, you invert parent-child relations, you pervert sexuality. And when it comes to human anthropology, you invert that and you put the body at the top, right? Mm-hmm. And what that does is that clouds the ability to see God and to remember God, as many of the church fathers say.
And that is humanism.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly the purpose of it. And that's why it's not just a human strategy of psychological warfare or whatever. I also think it's a spiritual strategy. And that's why so much of it at these elite levels involves Satanism and the pedophilia.
Yes, and I think you ended your talk is based on your research that you found what we're dealing with here is the people, the Atlanticists, the elite. These people truly are satanic, in the true sense of the word, because they want to rebel against nature or nature's God, and they want to invert everything, control everything. This feeds into their philosophy of like transhumanism and I mean, it's like it's like the Paradise Lost, right? Rather to rule in hell than serve in heaven.
Exactly. And
You know,
I also,
you know.
the more, I'm sorry.
Oh no, go ahead. That was my thought. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, you've had many spiritual writers that have talked about this, from, the Western and Eastern tradition about the demonic and how it works and how it functions and how it plays out in the real world. And I think that's this kind of stuff, even though it's dark, that we're talking about with the Western elite and all that, and elite elsewhere in the world, of course, too. I'm not denying that, because it's not a racial problem; it's a spiritual problem ultimately that afflicts man. And you have many spiritual writers talking about how that. Well, let me put it this way. I think if we think about the way that the ancient and medieval world thought, they viewed the world as what we might call the gods or demons. They, for whatever reason, by God, were given a temporal period of power, and the nations not part of God's covenant were under the rulership of these gods or demons. Now, that doesn't mean that every claim for a god is real. I'm not saying that, but I'm talking about just the biblical and traditional presentation of what demonology is. And so it doesn't mean that everybody's possessed. It just means that the upper echelon of those elite, and we see this, for example, in the book of Daniel, they are ruled over by these fallen entities. Now, the purpose of the coming of Christ and all that, the church, was to overtake the rule of idolatry and the rule of demons from the out of the hands of the demons and back into under the authority of Christ. That's the kingdom of God, and that's what Paul says in Ephesians when he says that we're not battling humans, we're battling spiritual dominions, principalities, and powers. I think that's the biblical, and that's actually in our liturgy too, the way the liturgy speaks about the nations being under the demons and so forth. Anyway,
this plays in Christ's temptation in the desert, right?
There you go. Exactly. Yeah. It's a great example of that. And now, what does this mean? Well, it means that we live in a world that's not very different from that world. And it doesn't matter whether Savile or any of these people are like cognizantly thinking about the like some demon or something. Like the actions themselves are demonic.
Yeah.
They don't have to be, literally thinking, I give this to you, Satan, or whatever. Because those actions themselves are of such a grave nature and perverted that a lot of people think that the Old Testament is silly and superstitious. I love the Old Testament. I read it frequently because what have you got in the Old Testament? You got people worshiping gods. You got people sacrificing humans. I mean, you've got. It sounds like what we read now.
Yeah,
that's what I'm trying to say. So I don't think that we actually live in a different world from the church fathers and the prophets. I think we live in that same world, but many people in the West have been blinded by materialism and false philosophies that and the mind control and the social that they're not able to recognize that Franklin Cover-Up, Sandusky, Jimmy Savile, any of these instances, human sacrifice, these things are real. Now I don't know exactly in every case when it happens, but I mean, humans are not different than they were 3,000 years ago.
No. They're
still humans.
Yeah.
So anyway.
So now your next one, you're going to be covering the Cold War, right?
Yeah, I think did I put you to sleep there with
no.
A sermon? Yeah, nuclear rivalry, Cold War. Nuclear rivalry in the Cold War, and then the new era, which the Cold War would produce, will probably be the next talk. And I'll either, do a final talk on the rest of it, or split it off and do kind of a recap and summary.
Yeah.
With the last chapter, because the last chapter is very illustrative too, because we almost see this kind of Quigley has these calls for tradition. We got to return to tradition. But the Western tradition that he talks about doesn't jive with the tradition of the bankers of the 20th century that he's tried to defend. So I think we'll see the problem for Quigley there.
And it will get into, I guess, the terror, the strategy of tension we call the Cold War,
Hmm.
and the nuclear terror, and how it helps the leader, the elite in the West, manage and engineer the West in certain directions. So that'll be interesting because what quickly has to say about that, and what we, and based on our own observations, what we've seen and subsequent research regarding some of the events of the Cold War going into the 60s. Now the book was published in 66,
Hmm.
so I don't know if he gets into the some of the politics of the 60s and the counterculture and all that stuff. But
It'll be interesting to see. Yeah,
yeah,
I'll definitely cover that.
yeah.
But
1 year before the Summer of Love, and I don't know if it was as yet identified as a full-blown hippie movement in these things. So
mm,
now, of course, we're coming up here. We're going to get your thoughts. We're coming up here on the 15th anniversary of 9/11. And you had you all had some interesting reflections on Boiler Room.
yeah,
With Hesher and
Andy Nowicki. Yeah,
Andy Nowicki. Patrick was there,
yeah, I think so. Yeah,
and am I leaving anyone out? It was some other guy from 21st Century Wire, I think.
Stuart Howe.
Stuart Howe, yeah. Now you all talked about, and also what were you 9/11? It's been 15 years, of course. I was well into my 30s. I had a child already and a wife. And when 9/11 happened, I didn't know. I was driving home. I was working a midnight graveyard shift at a job, and when I'd leave work, I just turn the radio on or turn my CD player on back when and listen to music on the way home. It was usually like a 25-minute, 30-minute drive. And I get in and walk into my townhouse, and my wife's holding my February, September, how old? It'd be 7-month-old daughter, and she says, "Another plane has hit the Twin Towers." And I go, "Another plane? What? What are you talking about?" And I end up staying up all day watching all the news coverage and experiencing that. It took me several years to really process it. I like most people, I accepted the official narrative of events, but then as the years passed on, I started noticing some inconsistencies, some problems, and I developed sort of a Ron Paul analysis of the situation. Would be blowback and this stuff, and that changed probably around 2007 through 2010.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't like an epiphany. It wasn't a road to Damascus conversion. It's just kind of a gradual. As I did the research, my opinions changed, and also I became aware of things like Northwoods. Like in 2002, I didn't know about this stuff, Northwoods, right. But I started looking into more things about COINTELPRO and its problems with the Kennedy assassination. So I started to develop a context for these events, which later on, as I analyzed the evidence of the attacks and what they really were, what they weren't, more of what they weren't. It wasn't so much of a shock to me that this might have been like a Pearl Harbor situation. I mean, literally, not like a new Pearl Harbor, meaning that we were either set up or was an inside job, like what Pearl Harbor was. We were it was a let it happen thing, whereas this might have been, it was like, I mean, I still don't know the details, but I suspect that there's various agencies, both foreign intelligence and domestic intelligence and corporation involved in this attack. So that was my understanding of the events. It evolved over the years as I did the research, as I availed myself of the information that was on the internet and did the research. And I kind of gradually developed an opinion on it. Not really coming out until probably around 2011 with my friends and family about what was really going on. That's when I felt confident about saying something.
Right.
And also my employment situation changed too. So that was significant.
Was there a key piece of data or thing that you read that really made you?
The visually, it was
just a slow transition from the sort of Ron Paul view, or
I think what did it for me was visual. It was the collapse of Building 7 and also the BBC reporting before it happened.
Right.
I could not reconcile that. I said that's foreknowledge, and then it was off to the races. For me, it was Building 7, which I happened to see on, I think, an Alex Jones clip on the internet. Mm-hmm. And then also, when I getting the internet, watching YouTube a lot, I got a television set where that YouTube was, I could get YouTube on, and I caught on to Richard Grove's Project Constellation
Mm.
and you should see what you've been missing. Or he did some report, and it was this like a 4-hour video of interviews and talks, and I just sat back one weekend, just watched it all, and
Wow.
that's what kind of threw. And so, then I read David Ray Griffin's, read about 8 or 9 of his books, things like that. So I really got into it,
Right.
So that was how I, experienced it,
Interesting. Yeah, I always like hearing people's, the journey that they had and stuff that they saw. And I don't know if I don't want to rehearse if I talked about that on Boiler Room, but I being a book guy, I was always impressed with, like I mentioned on that show, Tarpley's book. That stood out to me just because it was
Synthetic Terror.
Yeah, right around the time I was reading about, I was trying to dig into economics on a bigger scale and geopolitics, and I think I just finished undergrad or grad school, but that was a helped me put it into the big picture. I thought that it was probably fake since about 2004 or 5, just from some documentaries I'd seen, but I didn't really dig into research until some years later. I'd read a lot of online articles and some stuff from Jim Mars and things like that, but I think that Tarpley stands out because it's a geopolitical analysis. So many of the and now I can't recommend Tarpley anymore given his support for Hillary, but
I didn't know about that.
As far as I can tell, I think he's pro-Hillary now, but just because Trump is the new Hitler. But so
is he now? Is Trump an austerity ghoul?
Probably. I'm going to hold off on my Tarp impersonation, but I mean, Synthetic Terror is a great book.
It is a great book, yeah,
because it goes through the financial problems and all the false flags and these double agents, the fake terrorists, and goes back to Gladio, and he even has some sections on philosophy and Plato's cave and British empiricism and how that's a problem. And
learning about Gladio was big for me.
Mm-hmm.
That gives you kind of like a diagram how, or at least get context, history, how these things go down.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Funny you mentioned that Wim Hof book. That was actually, I was thinking that, what was that one book I wanted to get? And I sat here for a few minutes looking for it. And then it's like, oh, it's the book you were talking about.
Oh, okay.
The John Courtney Murray, Time, Life, and American Proposition. Yeah, I had that actually on my to-get list for a long time, but the only copy is $60 on Amazon. So.
Oh, yeah, that's right. It's right out of either Amazon or directly from Culture Wars website.
Okay. Yeah. I mean,
it's a 1,000-page book.
Oh wow!
Close to 1,000 pages. Yeah. So it's heavy stuff.
Well, you can read Solange Hertz's 100-page book if you want. But
there's also a long article in an edition of Culture Wars from last year.
Okay.
That the book is an expansion from that long article. So you can get that for like $4 from Culture Wars. So, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I forgot what I was going to say, but did you have a question about what I thought about 9/11, or just reflections?
Just reflections and the state, kind of like
Oh, okay.
How was it paradigm shattering for you, or was it
Oh well, kind of.
You were at a different stage in your life than I was. That's what
I was.
So it's still different.
When I was kind of a wild guy in high school, and then started kind of doing Bible study stuff. I got invited to some of that when I was 18, and got really into theology around that time, and got into reading conspiracy books. Believe it or not, I read some books on cults, and I read some books on the UN and New Age movement and all that stuff back when I was 18, and then so I kind of had an interest in the conspiracy side of things, but I mainly focused on theology. So when 9/11 happened, I didn't really have I was mildly political, just growing up as a Bush Baptist, GOP family. So when 9/11 happened, I didn't initially question it because I wasn't really interested in politics. I was just sitting around my job. I had an easy job where I mixed paint could read books all day. So I was basically just reading Calvinist theology. I was reading Calvin's Institutes and Charles Hodge, all these different Calvinists, and I didn't have a geopolitical context or any kind of big scale picture. I was 20, 21 when this happened. So when a couple years later, I got more interested in the American political spectrum, and I was starting to listen to right wing talk radio and tune into these different guys, and I'd hear Alex Jones, and I think I heard him talk about Bohemian Grove, and that one really struck me as kind of a paradigm changing thing, because it backed up some of the stuff I'd read a couple of years earlier about these elites being into the occult, and that was fitting well with the biblical theology that I was studying. I think at that time I was starting Bible college. And then, from there it branched out into looking at documentaries about specifically 9/11. And I've watched most of those that are, the older ones that everybody knows about. And then after a while, it just starts clicking. I think you realize that, well, it's sort of a, what do you call it? Not a golden chain, but like if this, then this, right? Like it necessitates this. So if, now wait a minute, if 9/11 is not true, maybe some of these other conspiracy things are true. Maybe we're not being told the truth about, what happened with JFK. Maybe we're not being told the truth about any number of things that are going on. And, you meet people and you learn from other people and you read a lot, and it just coalesces, and it kind of takes you down this path of revelation. I don't know how else to describe it. I mean, I'm not trying to make it overly spiritual, but I'm saying that ultimately I kind of think it is, because what you come to see is that a lot of what goes on is evil, but it also, there's a point where you kind of aren't afraid of evil anymore, because you realize that much of what is evil out there is based on just made up nonsense and lies.
Yeah.
The banality of evil, right? And I think that it gives you, well, it's like Jesus said, to borrow the CIA dictum and put it back into the Bible where it came from, then you shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and of course with the CIA, to them, you should know intelligence. Intelligence will set you free. That's what they mean by that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, and that's once you realize that a lot of it is fakery and just propaganda and fear mongering. You don't really, you're not worried about going out and being attacked by a terrorist, and you're not going out buying duct tape, duct taping your windows shut, dying carbon monoxide poisoning.
I think it was Herman Melville in his famous novel Confidence Man. He places the devil as the ultimate trickster, the ultimate con man.
Mm-hmm.
And so even the spiritual aspects of what's behind all this, I'm not saying it's not evil, it is. And I'm not saying that we should be flippant about evil, but, evil is really, according to the church fathers, it's a kind of negation. It's a movement towards non-being. And so that, in fact, is a weakness. And that's why evil, as it manifests in these geostrategies that we talk about, can only go against nature. And that's a great weakness, because humans, and ultimately I would say God, made us with a nature that is good. Our nature is good. Right now, I'm not saying that we don't sin, but I'm saying that nature itself, as God created it, is inherently good. And therefore, our very being itself testifies to that goodness. And so anything evil requires ultimately only harming ourselves. And that's its greatest weakness, I guess you could say. Yeah,
and that goes back to the free will thing and inviting Dracula in. You have to invite him in, and that
right.
Because there's a pop culture reference. I remember there's a scene. Do you remember the miniseries The Stand?
I did watch that. Yeah,
very good adaptation of the book. I thought it was a very good miniseries, and there's a scene in it where the old man is in the jail cell and Flag, who is the devil, is interrogating him, and he starts to use his powers, makes his arthritis act up and feel pain, and the old man goes, "It's not so bad, really," and he says, just to, just bow before me and I'll let you free. Just bow.
Right.
And he kind of does a pause and he starts to laugh. He's just, and to think we made such a fuss about you back in Colorado, you're really pathetic. And, and then he says, shoot him. So his henchman shoots him. But the point is there's victory there. He's all of a sudden he no longer fears the evil anymore. Mm-hmm. And I thought there was a good theological insight in that scene, with the nature of evil, so.
Yeah, it is a good book. I read that when I was in my 20s, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. And they're supposed to be making a remake of that at some point with, I think, Javier Bardem. But
really? Okay.
I don't know if that fell through, but I agree. And, it just goes back to what Jesus says in, I think it's either John 8 or John 10, where he says that, the devil was a murderer and a liar from the beginning. So,
so it's only naturally he'd go into government service. Right?
Yeah, so I was going to say.
Go into politics.
I think, I've heard you make that statement before. It's absolutely appropriate. Yeah.
It's a perfect profession. So. And one thing that's interesting also about In the Stand is how his henchmen are just people who just need a job. They're not.
That's a great point.
They're not all really bad people. Some are bad. Some are. But some are these, there's a former cop and there's a military guy, functionary. Guys who are used to just taking orders, bureaucrats. This attacks that mindset. And these are the type of people that are drawing the flag.
That's a good point. Yeah, similar presentations, kind of in Dostoevsky novels too.
Yeah,
you get the evil characters, or the pathology, the psychology is very similar.
And that's the banality of evil. Yes, there you go. So. Okay, well, Jay, listen, it's almost 2 hours. I want to thank you for spending so much of your evening with me tonight. We talked about a lot. I think it was a good talk.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, it was great. And I'll look forward to was it part 7?
Yeah.
Yeah, part 7. Mm-hmm. And I'll take a look out for that and some of your other interviews. I just I downloaded your is it Cory Biko? Pronounce that name?
Koripko,
yeah. I've listened to a couple of his interviews before, so I look forward to listening to that next week sometime. That'd be good.
Yeah, he's a sharp guy. I enjoyed talking to him.
So great. Listen, Jay, thanks, and I'll let you, leave for the night.
Okay.
Kind of late. I think it's 10 o'clock where you are. So.
It is, but I had worked out earlier, so I was a little slow of mind, but.
No, it's great.
Yeah. All right, thanks, Tim.
Listen, take care, and maybe a little while we'll talk again, and
definitely
do that. And
I still want to have you talk to you about some stuff.
Oh yeah, just any time. Just send me an email.
I just keep forgetting to do it.
Just send me an email, but so.
Okay.
We'll set something up. Great.
All right. Have a good night.
Take it easy. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.